Thanks to Andrea and to Jennifer and all of you for the invitation to be here. I'm going to stay sitting down because otherwise I have to hold my notes and with my glasses and it's all very complicated. But these are the things that I'm going to talk about. So in case you want to spend the next hour catching up on your email, the main message of my talk is that data as a term is too flat an ontology for the kinds of things that we're all dealing with. It reduces people, events, objects to things, bits, to be imagined as impersonal, scientific, and neutral. And the use of the word data tends to assume that everything is digital. This is wrong. So that's the kind of headline message of what I'm going to say. It's going to take me a while to get back to that, so through all of these sorts of points. So as Andrea already mentioned, my own background is in science and technology studies, having first studied economics. So when we were talking acronyms yesterday, I thought it was a brilliant way to introduce a panel session, by the way, especially with a disparate kind of group. For you, SSK is Sustainable Software Kit. For me, it's Sociology of Scientific Knowledge. We have other acronyms in my field. ANT, you might have heard of. You can do a lot with ANT. It's a great abbreviation. Actor Network Theory, SCOT, Social Construction of Technology. There are lots of them. Some point, somebody said we should put a moratorium. No new concepts, no new abbreviations, or if you introduce one, you've got to throw one out. I think digital humanities could think about adopting that policy. There are a lot of abbreviations in digital humanities. Anyway, in science and technology studies, we're concerned with questions of how knowledge is produced, how technologies come into being, how they're used, what kinds of policies can be used to support science and technology. Traditionally, the focus has been on the natural sciences, physics, biology, engineering. But increasingly, insights from science and technology studies are also being applied to social sciences and humanities. Another kind of caveat I think I should make, some people mistakenly believe that science and technology studies is anti-science. This is also not true. Actually, I think a lot of people in my field are wannabe scientists. They're all kind of completely fascinated by science and technology and what it does in the world. And they're fascinated because science and technologies are remarkable human achievements, just like art. And we kind of try and study them in similar sorts of ways. So this changing research context, you know, some of us have kind of lived through a lot of this. There are different terms in circulation to talk about it, things like Mode 2, post-normal science, transdisciplinarity, the triple or quadruple helix. All of these kind of get used to talk about what's going on. But it's basically in the sort of from the mid-20th century onward, these points. So particularly in Western countries, a growth in universities, both in terms of numbers of staff, numbers of students, new sorts of disciplines and interdisciplines emerging, like science and technology studies, gender studies, digital humanities are all instances of those. Something we all suffer from, the greater accountability for what we're up to. The success of big science, starting in physics, but then also being taken as the kind of the norm and ideal that everybody else should be doing, of kind of international and interdisciplinary teams. And we've seen the use of digital technologies in all stages of knowledge production across many different sorts of fields. And of course, digital technologies are implicated in at least the last three of those, that without digital technologies, those accountability systems, that international collaboration would be a lot harder to do. Now, there are lots and lots of terms that are around that we've seen, and the idea is you can put any of the ones kind of closest to me in front of any of the ones in the cloud, and okay, they don't all work, but many of them work. And if you've been around long enough, you'll know that they have fashions. Sometimes, you know, we're more interested in tele or cyber or virtual. At the moment, the big things, I think, are open and smart. We get a lot of those. Some of them are simply descriptive. Some of them, I think, are highly normative. And I don't need to tell a kind of audience of humanities scholars that words matter. For many of you, words are what you kind of concern yourselves with. And I think the choice of words that we use really matters a lot. And I'll come back to that towards the end to talk about the kinds of words that we use to talk about data. So that's the changing research context. So what have we learned about digital technologies, or technologies as a whole? Now this is, where I come into my own. This is my field. I've been studying this for a very long time. One of the kind of basic starting points of science and technology studies is that technologies have politics. As I've just said, they don't fall out of the sky. They are made by people, particular interests in particular economic and political and social contexts. One of the most famous examples in my field is the Underpasses of New York City, and Robert Moses, who was the city planner there for a very, very long time, from the 1920s to the 1970s. And the kind of story goes that he wanted to restrict access to the parks and beaches around Long Island. So 200 overpasses on Long Island have the exceptionally low clearance of 2.7 meters, which at the time that they were built meant that buses couldn't get under them. Only the kind of cars of the rich white people could make it to the beaches of Long Island. Of course, things have changed since then, which is, a good thing. But, he did try and kind of build into the infrastructure a particular kind of racist politics. And of course, there are many, many kind of examples of that. I like to think, I'm trying to develop some work around what I call hostile technologies, or hostile by design. We hear a lot about privacy by design and transparency by design. Some days I'm not so optimistic about the world. I think hostility by design actually captures a lot better what some designers are up to. Sticking with urban infrastructures, some of you may have noticed in some cities, more and more park benches have little armrests, and you might think, oh, how nice, an armrest. No. This is another instance of hostility by design. It's to stop homeless people lying down on them. No homeless people have been exploited in the production of this photograph. That's my partner lying here. Fun living with STS people. You get to go out and pretend to be homeless people. So this, I particularly like this park bench. It does have a lamp on it, so homeless people can read, is how I interpret it, but it's probably another device to try and stop them lying down and sleeping. So technologies have politics, politics have technologies, but we don't have time to go into that at the moment. Next thing we've learned is that new technologies are introduced into existing worlds, and they have old social forms to kind of deal with. This was originally, well, in my view, discussed by Raymond Williams, a British historian writing about television. Also taken up in media studies and elsewhere when people talk about remediation or intermediation. And I think the fact that we have old social forms has huge implications for how new technologies are taken up and used. And we see that in the academic world as well. It's all very well having fancy things that enable open access if you have systems of publishing that aren't terribly keen on open access. Similarly with, how work is organized and promotions are organized. So that's another important thing I think we can learn from STS. Probably about 5 people in the room will understand the photograph, but another important thing is the idea that technologies could have been otherwise. And this is what gives one hope, gives me hope. Bicycles used to look like that. They now look very different. I live in the Netherlands now. I see lots of bicycles. And there's been a history of bicycles written. It's very important in my field. There are also my own PhD, which is now a tiny little footnote in the great and glorious history of the internet, was about OSI networks, open systems interconnection. Old people in the room will also remember. This was a perfectly well-functioning alternative to connecting computers over distance back in the kind of 70s and 80s that governments invested in, but for various reasons I won't go into, the kind of protocols and standards of the internet kind of won out. So infrastructure tends to kind of hang around for a long time, but it can change, it can be different. So that's the fact that things could have been otherwise in the past, also gives one hope that things could be otherwise in the future. So that means it's important to keep busy and keep doing things. Another important insight, but I mean this isn't unique to STS, is the idea that knowledge is power, classifications have consequences. We hear stories about this now every single day when, you know, for example, LinkedIn only shows certain job ads to men because historically men have done those sorts of jobs, so that's a nice way of kind of keeping that system going. People, you know, getting their insurance turned down or accepted based on certain kinds of profiles that they may or may not fit. You know, there's lots and lots and lots of examples of this, from everything from policing to healthcare to education. And that, I think digital technologies have important kind of roles to play here, which I will also come back to when I'm talking about data. So I see people are still coming in. I'm not going to repeat myself, but in terms of speed, am I comprehensible? Yes. Thank you, good. Right, so we've also learned things about how knowledge is produced. This is what some of the early fights, if you like, between traditional philosophy of science and science studies were about. That traditional philosophy of science is very much concerned with the content of science. The kind of thing that science and technology studied added to all of this was, well, we need to kind of look at the context in which scientific knowledge is actually produced, to look more at the kind of social aspects, the interactions, the kind of context of knowledge production. But we have learned a lot from history and philosophy of science about how knowledge is produced. One thing we've learned is, which I think is particularly relevant for DARIAH, is that knowledge is always inscribed in and by instruments. It really makes a difference if you've got a microscope or not. And it makes a difference if you have access to telescopes, and it makes a difference if you've got access to really fast computers or really slow computers. The possibilities, what you can do in terms of producing knowledge, really fundamentally depends on the kind of means of knowledge production, if you want to put it in those sorts of terms. Another thing we've learned is that knowledge is deeply social in context of discovery and certainly in context of justification and use. You know, big science, you know, which kind of started or often is assumed to have started in the post-war period, okay, the scale might have increased, but the fact that people work together has been going on for a very, very long time. Knowledge is very, very kind of social in its production, but also in the kind of system of publication, in how universities work, and how academies work, and how libraries and archives work. So, yeah, it's a social process. It's not a kind of neutral, external kind of process. But there are lots and lots of different ways of producing knowledge, and you know, especially with this group, it's a very kind of diverse in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, and I'm guessing very diverse in terms of methodological commitments. You all, you know, if we had a little kind of survey now, I'm sure we'd learn a lot about different kinds of ways of doing research, what you think kind of counts as knowledge, and how you get there. I think on the next slide there's some references, but a guy called Alistair Crombie he's an historian, wrote some really big books in which he kind of examined styles of scientific thinking and styles of reasoning. And I mean, I'm not going to, this isn't a History of the Philosophy of Science lecture. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but I'm sure, depending on your own background, you will recognize one or more of these. I mean, I've listed them here more or less in chronological order, but the point is that, we still engage in deductive reasoning. People still do experiments, they still produce taxonomies. Just because we have statistics doesn't mean all these other things have kind of gone out the window. And this is the kinds of things that Crombie and others have talked about. So every kind of style of reasoning introduces what Crombie calls a new world of possibilities in terms of epistemic objects, in terms of criteria for what counts as good science or bad science, for what counts as true or false. And these styles transcend microsocial contexts. So there's a lot of work in science and technology studies that based on kind of lab studies, it's called. You go into a laboratory and you watch what biologists kind of spend their days doing. That's getting increasingly more difficult as a lot of biologists spend their days looking at computer screens, which makes it not so interesting to look at anymore. But a lot of science and technology studies work was based in labs and describing the kind of microsocial processes of particular labs. And very valuable work indeed was done using those kinds of ethnographic and anthropological approaches. But I think the point of the previous slide was that we do have these scientific styles that go beyond particular local contexts. And this is one of the big debates in STS, is between the local and the universal, but I won't bore you with that. That kind of set of styles, I think, also provides a useful framework for doing historical and philosophical research. And as I've already said, there are possibilities for kind of merging and splitting the different sorts of styles. And one doesn't necessarily replace or drive out the other. But the big question now is, are we seeing the emergence of a computational style? And I think, if we are, okay, it may or may not drive out all those other ways of doing research and producing knowledge, and it may or may not have these characteristics. But I think, based on my experience, as Andrea already said, kind of organizing a digital humanities program for a number of years and sort of hanging out with people like you over a number of years, I think these are characteristics of what I could call a kind of computational style that is emerging. And particularly today, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, is the data-driven aspect of that. But I think all of these other things are important as well. I did say to a couple of people who were in the room when they were giving a presentation a week or two ago that this commercial aspect, I think, is under-discussed in digital humanities. That IBM has been there from the beginning. The big commercial companies have a really important role to play, and we need to not be naive about what that role might be. But I mean, that's, as I say, I originally studied economics. Old habits die hard. These are, for me, important sorts of issues. And I think partly because of the commercial aspects, the issue of the black boxing becomes more important. So, see, I'm going to come out and be honest. It was my 60th birthday a few days ago, so I am feeling old. I'm now in my 7th decade. I'm trying to embrace this. Yeah, well, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, old people like me, we know things. That's good. And one of the things we know is that the first computers we had in our homes were kind of held together with paper clips and bits of sticky tape, and you had to stand on one leg and hold it up in the air and to get it to work. You really had to know how computers worked if you wanted to use a computer. And you had to know that kind of stuff. Nowadays, if you were to turn up in the Apple store with a screw slightly loose, and not metaphorically, then they would, your guarantee wouldn't be working anymore. They would just say, well, tough luck. There have been, And it makes it easier to use, it makes it possible for more people to kind of have access to technologies, but it does mean that it's becoming increasingly black boxed, both the hardware and the software increasingly, as you'll see with kind of machine learning and things like that, that most of us really don't have a clue how these things work. And I think if you're in the business of producing knowledge, like most of us are, it's kind of important that we know how our tools work. It's not just enough to kind of, press a few buttons and get a nice picture. There's kind of more going on. Another kind of anecdote, but I think it's a kind of revealing one. Okay, here we talk about digital humanities, eHumanities, some of the things that I showed earlier. I was involved with some colleagues in the Netherlands a few years ago writing what we called a white paper for something that never happened, the Center for Humanities and Technology. And this was a big interdisciplinary effort with humanities people and computer scientists, and I was kind of coordinating it and editing it, and we were more or less finished, and I, in a good Dutch way, I sent it, or in a good DARIAH way as well, sent it to people for, consultation, and doesn't sit naturally. I got it back from one of the computer scientists and said, "Oh, dear Sally, looks great. I've changed everywhere where you had digital humanities and put computational humanities." Thank God for computers, it was easy to go change back. So I wrote very politely back to him. I said, well, I did this for a reason. Words are important. And my problem with computational humanities is that it presumes a certain kind of style of doing humanities that is trying to kind of mimic and emulate the natural sciences. And for some things, that's perfectly fine. I'm not, but you can do a lot more with computers in terms of representations, in terms of analysis, and by using the term digital humanities, which it did say in a footnote on the first page, I was trying to keep that open. So I went back and changed them all to digital humanities. But the point of that story is partly to illustrate that there is a move, certainly in some parts of the Netherlands, to use computational methods as a way of scientizing the humanities. And I'm using science here in the narrow English sense of it, of the natural sciences. And I say, there are things we can do with that. It raises new kind of epistemic possibilities, that's fine, but there's still other things we can do. There's still other ways of doing research and producing knowledge that computers can help us with, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to adopt all of those particular sorts of properties. So let me move on to some more things, data, as that is the theme of these few days. I must say, you DARIAH people are really tough people. It seems, it goes on for days and days. I'm too old for that now. So here, I think some questions we could have, and there I can see at least some of them in the room, for the DARIAH directors, how they would answer these questions. Because I think they're important questions. And I'll, in a few minutes, say something more about the digital aspects of it. But if we're doing some kind of digital humanities, does that mean that all of the data, material, whatever you want to call it, has to be digital? And you might think, well, yes, because otherwise you can't process it or analyze it or whatever. I think that's kind of problematic because not everything is digital. I'm sure that won't come as news to the librarians and the archivists and the people from cultural heritage organizations, where even in a rich country like the Netherlands, they reckon in terms of cultural heritage, maybe 15% of the assorted books, objects, archives are available digitally. I learnt recently for the Dutch National Government Archives, only 5% are available digitally. This is really important for historians because it's not a randomly distributed 5%. So I think, if we're going to go kind of digitally data-driven as a way of doing research, every now and then we need to kind of stop and ask ourselves these questions about what this means for the research that we're doing and how we're doing it. So, what was more or less promised in my title, this is the problem, if you're asked to give a keynote, sometimes you just ask for a title, which is great. You just go, yeah, titles are easy. Didn't have to think of an abstract, and it was only, how am I going to get to this title? So, what do we know about data? What are we talking about when we talk about data in humanities? The themes of these few days. None of my pictures were innocent. You might not have got all of them, but or you might have come up with your own explanations for my pictures. This might look like an innocent picture. If you, those of you with computers, if you're not doing your email, if you Google big data and you press on pictures, most of them will be that shade of blue. I don't know why that is, but it is a true empirical fact. So somebody would like, some visual cultural person could go and study that and let me know. That would be great. So blue is the color of data. But that's, as a definition, not terribly good. So here we have two definitions. So this one, this came up yesterday, and SHOCK, my new acronym for the week, from the European Open Science Cloud people. This is why we have philosophers. This is a really, really bad definition. It's tautological, it's circular. How they got away with publishing this, I don't know. So it's a high-level expert group, but not a philosophers. Or data is what this says. Not helpful. Christine Borgman, much better definition, talks about data, at least she uses the plural, which is also reassuring, that they're representations of observations, objects, other entities used as evidence. Okay, that's also a much, much better definition than the one given by the European Open Science Cloud people, but I'm still not entirely happy with Borgman's definition. And so, I mean, I could talk for hours about this particular slide, but I'll keep it brief. These are what I call some of the myths of big data. I once gave a big talk at my university. I wanted to call it lies, but I thought that was too provocative, so I went with myths. That was still quite provocative. Other people have said I should talk about it as imaginaries, but actually I don't like them. I think imaginaries is too nice here. I think the people who use these kind of ideas have it's not only an imaginary, they're trying to achieve something. And you know, we've all seen those kind of claims from the Commission, from Davos, from all sorts of groups about data being the new gold, the new oil. And you probably can't see them terribly well, but there we have some poor seals covered in oil in the top picture and a traffic jam as a reminder of the unintended consequences of oil, that it didn't always work out quite how people were hoping. And that's a lab mouse. And the point of part of this is to illustrate the second point, that data are never, ever given. Philosophers have known this for a really, really long time. To make data, and we all know this as well, is a lot of work. It's a lot of work for everybody. They never speak for themselves, they require interpretation, and they are always plural in every kind of sense of the word plural. So as I said, the main point is to turn what Christine Borgman talks about as to make those representations of observations and experiments and whatever, to make that into data is a lot of work, and to make it into machine readable data is also a lot of work. Okay. Suzanne will recognize the working group on women's writing. Thank you for the picture. So one of the examples that I have discussed with some people here of the kind of tensions, and maybe creative, between computer scientists and, in this case, literary historians, is how we code gender. So the International Standards Organization Code for the Representation of Human Sexes, I don't know if you can read that at the back, but it's 0 for not known, 1 for male, 2 for female, 3 for not applicable, or 9 for not applicable. And towards the bottom, it says no priority should be kind of, read into 1 for male, 2 for female. There's some wonderful feminist analysis to be done of the ISO code, but the problem is, for people like Suzanne and many others who are interested in, for example, 17th, 18th, 19th century women authors who wrote using a male name. How are we going to capture this in a database? Now, I think if you can build a supercomputer, you should be able to capture this in a database, but it's problematic because we have the power of classifications and the power of historic classifications, what I was saying earlier about classifications having consequences. So it is really kind of difficult to challenge and change these sorts of things. But unlike other things that have happened in the United States recently, the Library of Congress is trying to do something about this. And sorry, this might not be terribly readable at the back, but the sentence that I've underlined in the middle says, gender is socially constructed. Again, not news for all of you, but really, really important if we want to kind of move beyond a kind of binary gender in order to kind of develop richer databases, in order to do the kind of analysis that actually humanities scholars and social scientists have been doing for decades that recognize the fluidity of gender. So, while digitalization can produce all sorts of new epistemic objects that we can all have lots of fun with, it may also reduce them. And I think that's something we need to kind of watch out for and try and do something about. So one of the issues is, as I've already said, not everything is already digital. And what do we do about all that data that is not yet machine readable? So I've already given some examples, but I think there are many other sorts of reasons why data might not be there. So again, being an old person, I still have 5¼ inch discs. Now, I could probably go somewhere and get somebody to read them for me, but they're not easily accessible to me anymore. This is true for all sorts of data that is stored on media that is no longer easily accessible to our current infrastructures, current technologies. There are some things some people are trying to keep secret. So, in the intelligence services, okay, the people who work there have access to that data, but it's not easily accessible to the rest of us. There are taboo or very sensitive topics. We don't have great data on sexual abuse or childhood abuse. The problems of changing classifications, which I've already mentioned. And the reason I've put up this Occupy picture is we don't actually have very good data about the rich. Irving Goffman, an American sociologist, is rumored to have said on his deathbed, "We should have studied the rich." Sociologists spend a lot of time studying the poor and to some extent the middle classes, but the rich are actually kind of interesting because they're very powerful and they're really, really good at hiding their wealth, hiding their money, hiding all sorts of things about what they're up to. So it's hard to study the rich, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't kind of give it a go. And I think one of the kind of achievements of Thomas Piketty's work and kind of all of the kind of renewed interest in inequality is people are trying to kind of make sense of very disparate data sources to understand inequality and how it's evolving. The computed data is what I've said, this black box data that, nobody has a clue how it's generated, yeah, a different kind of paradigm. And then for Andrea, really, who's originally a physicist, as I'm sure she's told you. Okay, the Large Hadron Collider. This is kindly provided by colleagues from the Dutch National Institute for Subatomic Physics, which is also in Amsterdam. I think this is a great picture. Now, I don't know if you can, on the far side, it says filtering of the data. Now, when this Large Hadron Collider does its thing, 40 million collisions are produced every second by the colliding beams. I'm not a physicist. This is, Large Hadron Colliders for, simpletons. Only a tiny fraction of those are deemed interesting enough for physicists. So of those 40 million collisions, they collect 600. That's a tiny little proportion. And those 600 generate a gigabyte of data per second. So that's why they need all these supercomputers and all these kind of fancy bits of equipment. But for me, for a science studies person, the interesting bit is, how do they decide which 600? They have a committee, you'll be glad to know. So don't let anyone ever tell you that physics is not social, is not political, is not constructed. These are physicists who, on the basis of the best physics knowledge available to us at the moment, I'm sure they're doing their best and doing a good job, decide which are the collisions that are really interesting and are going to help us understand subatomic particles even better. Great, go guys, this is fun. And I kind of asked David Group and Frank Linde, who I kind of vaguely know, this is really interesting. How do you kind of decide this? And do you do any machine learning? And they don't do any machine learning yet. It's hard coded into the selection. For them, machine learning, for them, it's too black boxed. And I think if the subatomic physicists are thinking it's too black boxed, what are we doing? Data's really interesting. And I think that's another important point. While I think we need to be very careful about data and really reflect on data and where it comes from and what we can do with it, the production of science and technology is an amazing human activity. The production of data is also an amazing human activity. So physicists are interesting, but so are humanities scholars. And I think we can learn a lot from humanities about data and how we talk about data. So I'm almost finished, Andrea, getting there. And so I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the kinds of metaphors we use when talking about data. These new metaphors are really powerful, and they help us to understand new things. They help us kind of make sense of complex phenomena. It came up yesterday, I think, in the discussion, the kinds of words we use to talk about data. So the top ones, and I've already mentioned these, the kind of data water. I mean, no one ever talks about data as water, but they use data flow, data deluge, data overflows, floods, tsunamis. There's a lot of watery data images out there, thus the waterfall. And as I've already talked about, the data as resource, the oil, gold to be exploited kind of metaphor. These are very different metaphors, and they have different kind of connotations and different sorts of associations. And I think one of the problems about the flowing data is the idea that it's just flowing. And it, again, neglects and makes invisible the huge amounts of work that are needed to make data flow from the experiment to the database to the repository. All of these things require work. Flowing data is not done by fairies while we're sleeping. It's really kind of hard work. My own pet hate is cloud. Cloud is just another word for other people's computers. And talking about clouds, which is also, I guess, a bit watery, is, oh, clouds, that's nice. But yeah, other people's computers. We get data exhaust, data trails, which again make it sound that's like the kind of byproducts from the resource kind of metaphor. The raw cooked thing, which we all know is not a good thing. The clean, dirty kind of thing, which anthropologists can have a lot of fun with. But again, we all know, cleaning data is not an innocent, neutral activity. It's a lot of work to get data into a format that can be kind of analyzed by whatever means you want to do. So actually, I think all the words that the humanities uses to talk about data are actually much richer. I mean, there are probably many words, but these fit nicely on the slide, about primary and secondary sources, texts and all their kind of forms, objects, music, art, archives, interlocutors, respondents, ego documents, letters, whatever. All of these sorts of things, you could talk about them as data, but I'm not sure why you'd want to. So unless you want to kind of take part in discussions about data and about infrastructures for data, then I can see it makes some kind of sense and there might be some value to that. But I think it's important to kind of remember that, as I said at the beginning, data flattens the complexity and richness and variety of the kinds of materials that I think humanities scholars are primarily concerned with. So I've just learned how these things work, so I kind of... so these are my conclusions. I hope, I mean, that, yeah, I mean, for a DARIAH audience, obviously you're kind of interested in technology. I think there's some people in the humanities who aren't interested in technology, but which I don't understand. I think technology is really interesting. It's interesting as an object of study, but it's also interesting as a tool, also interesting for the methodological opportunities that it raises. I think history matters. The histories of our fields, as I was saying earlier, the kind of what counts as good and bad and true and false is very much conditioned by kind of epistemic communities and their histories. What else did I want to say? Methods and theories matter, you know that, and that words matter, that we are talking about a lot more than just data. And I think humanities scholars and the social sciences have a lot to offer in helping us to think through data in a kind of world where digital technologies are being used more and more. So thank you very much.